So, this video is all about Virginia Satir's coping stances, the survival stances that we go into to help us survive when we're young, and which we keep doing as adults because that's what we learned when we were young. The good thing about survival stances is that they help us survive. They really do. The bad thing about them is that they interfere with the maximum enjoyment of ourselves, others, and the world, and they inhibit growth. So, as with most things on Earth, there's both good and bad. So without further ado, here we go. Welcome to the Satir model's coping stances. The first thing I want to point out is that Virginia Satir was a very early systems specialist. Her ability to quickly identify patterns and see the beauty in the system was undoubtedly one of her greatest gifts and contributions. She very adeptly identified the organization and function of the nuclear family. Of course, you start with an individual, and then along comes another. Then ultimately, the two individuals decide to spend some significant time together, and they become a dyad, two in a relationship. Pretty stable. Compared with what, you may ask? Well, compared with what's about to happen, that's what. Virginia called this the primary triad. It's the first of a series of systems of which we become a part in our earthly existence. The family system is arguably the most influential of all systems. Within it, the child becomes both the agent and manifestation of change. But a triad is significantly less stable than a dyad. It almost seems as if life was designed to be unstable, but that's another conversation. For a child, ensuring survival is really the core issue. You may or may not remember having the belief that your survival was at stake as a child, but that's always the core issue for babies and children. Virginia looked at survival in terms of self, other, the other person, and context. When life is safe and predictable for the young child, they have a parent or parents appropriately attentive to their needs, they develop trust in others and in the world they live in, their context. We would consider this child to be securely attached. As a child with secure attachment grows, they're guided by mature parents to consider others and trust the world they live in. A parent who does this is functioning congruently. A child reared by such a parent or parents is likely to grow up to function congruently as well. We need to be sure to remember that we're talking about people here, so let's add some illustrations back. We have the self iceberg, and the other person has an iceberg too. We don't have access to it the way we do to ours, but we need to remember that they have one. And the context is everything else that relates to one or both of us. To continue the ocean metaphor, since icebergs float in the water, that would be the sea and the sun, the wind, the birds, the fish, and we'll throw in a few other people too. All those icebergs. Virginia was very clear on that point. We can only be in true purposeful communication with one person at a time. So what happens when we're in a group, like a family? Well, things can change pretty quickly in a family. And they keep changing. You see how the other is changing when you give your attention to one and then another and then another, and then the context changes too. But the one thing that stays constant is the self. More or less constant. There are changes in our iceberg too, but when we're congruent, we're designed to have a kind of a stability of self that supports congruence even under pressure. Does anyone feel like this is a family beach vacation? I don't know, it just made me think of that. So, the one constant is you. Yourself. You are the still point. And while on one hand, that's an incredibly obvious point I made, paradoxically, there are times when we forget that we're the constant, the still point. We may not be feeling very steady. Perhaps we're in the chaos. It's those times that we go into survival mode, specifically social survival mode. And like all survival behaviors, it maximizes efficiency and minimizes aesthetic. So, the coping stances They're survival stances, and they're all based on discounting or ignoring, invalidating basically, one or more segments of the triad that makes up full congruence. Let me list the 4 coping stances. The first is called the blaming stance. The second, the placating stance. The third, the super reasonable stance. And the fourth is the irrelevant stance. So how does it all work? Let's bring back our illustrations. The first stance is called the blaming stance. When a person enacts a blaming stance, they're attending to the self and their own interests. They're also attending to the context, but they are not attending to, giving credence to, or validating the iceberg of the other person. Virginia called them stances because she had actual stances for them. Psychodrama was very big in the 70s. We call it expressive arts now. It's a little trivia. This is an illustration from her book of someone in a blaming stance standing and pointing at the other person. I tend to like the blaming emoji. When we talk about coping stances, it's most useful to think about them from our own perspective, with us occupying the self role always. The main reason for that is it's easy to trick oneself into accusing others of being in coping stances, and that puts us square in a blaming stance every time, so we don't want to do that. Now, a person in a blaming stance can be in any mood, but often people in blaming stances are angry. Frequently, they're also disappointed. They might even be afraid, but typically that feeling isn't very near the surface. That combination makes them look the way they do. The next stance is called the placating stance. When a person enacts a placating stance, they're attending to the other person and their interests. They're attending to the context, but they are not attending to, giving credence to, or validating their own iceberg. They're disconnected from themselves. Here's an illustration from the Satir model of the placating stance. In my opinion, there are a number of emojis that work for the placating stance because people in it have so many different faces that they put on. It's almost like a person in the placating stance is changing themselves out of desperation. A person in a placating stance generally has quite a bit of fear. They may not be showing it though, and they may not think of it as fear, and they may not even know that they're afraid. It might manifest in physical ailments, but they have a lot of other feelings too. When asked respectfully and with interest, they can access those feelings and talk about them, but they don't generally feel free to access them in the moment when they go into the survival stance. They may even be blocking their own fear. The next coping stance is called the super reasonable stance. In the early days, Virginia called it computer or computing because someone's tone in super reasonable stance sounds rather distant and academic. When we're in a super reasonable coping stance, all of our attention is on the context with no connection to the self and none to the other either. Now you may be wondering, how does that work? Well, here's an illustration. A rather priggish person with nose in the air. Make a little more sense now? I don't know how many of you have ever heard of the book, The Gentle Art of Verbal Self-Defense by Patricia Evans. It's kind of dated now, but it has some decent techniques if one is into techniques. That's a very super reasonable approach, by the way, instead of learning to support one's congruence. One of the most annoying and intractable ways of defending oneself against a verbal attack is described by the author as, quote, talking like a computer, unquote. She's basically telling people to use this coping stance. Now, no one really likes to deal with someone who's in this coping stance, and of course, the person in the super reasonable coping stance is in survival mode, so they're usually not enjoying themselves either. The feelings that they're having but not feeling are probably related to fear, possibly feeling trapped and helpless. It might be difficult to get them to connect with those feelings. I have a theory that sometimes children who had to use a placating stance quite a bit to survive eventually find it too exhausting and inefficient to continue. Being in placating is terribly exhausting. Having lost touch with themselves, if they don't get some support to reestablish that connection with self, the super reasonable coping stance is a natural attempt to reclaim some of their power. A person in a placating stance is often working so hard to avoid blame that they develop their intellectual skill to the point where they're quite intelligent, but they can't get anyone to want to include them on teams because they don't connect to themselves or others. They're just not that much fun to be around. So they may be a little isolated and lonely too. The last coping stance is called the irrelevant stance. Apparently, the early term for it was distracted. And the thing about the irrelevant stance is that someone who's using it is disconnected from the self, but also from the other, and the context as well. What do you think about that? Sounds a little crazy, right? You're probably wondering, how do they function? An excellent question. People using an irrelevant coping stance when they are uncomfortable in a situation, they approach it in one of a few ways. They might start by creating a diversion, telling a joke to shift the context. Joking is pretty big with irrelevant stance people. They might check out in some way, perhaps by falling asleep, by ghosting, running away, or using drugs to help them disconnect, drinking, alcohol, any kind of use of drugs for that reason. The Satir model's illustration was this, giving the sense of being all over the place without a sense of direction. Psychosis and syncope, fainting spells, they're seen as more extreme but involuntary manifestations of the irrelevant coping stance, but they're still an irrelevant coping stance. It's important to remember this. We all use all four of the coping stances, although we may typically use one or two more regularly. They do serve a legitimate purpose. They ensure our individual survival and the survival of our species. We wouldn't want to simply eliminate them, even if we could. However, the downside is they do interfere with congruence. Reducing our reliance on coping stances can happen by building our congruence. It's a bit like walking a path that leads us right into our own iceberg. The better connected we are to our own iceberg, the more congruent our communication.